They had taken her name, they had taken her home. Now, on a slave's auction block, they would sell what was left of her dignity. Lady Alaina, the daughter of a betrayed lord, was now chattel, a prize for the man who destroyed her family. But in the shadows, a warrior watched. The king's champion, a man scarred by the same fire that consumed her life. He had made a secret vow upon a grave of ashes, and he would not let her fall. He would buy her back from the darkness, not as a master, but as her shield. The cold mud of the market square was a merciless thief. It stole the last traces of warmth from Alaina's bare feet, seeping into her bones with a damp chill that felt cruelly permanent. She stood upon a crude wooden block, a pedestal of shame, dressed in a burlap shift that did nothing to ward off the biting autumn wind. The fabric was rough against her skin, a constant scratching reminder that her silks and velvets had been turned to ash, just like her home. The crowd was a beast, with 100 mouths, each one spitting jeers and crude laughter. These were the same people who had once bowed their heads as her father's carriage passed. Now they pointed and stared, their eyes filled with a greedy, feverish curiosity. They saw not a lady, but a fallen thing, a spectacle to break the monotony of their day. Alaina kept her chin high, her gaze fixed on a distant gray cloud. It was a small act of rebellion, the only one she had left. She would not give them her tears. From a velvet-draped balcony overlooking the square, Baron Theron watched the scene with a placid smile. He was a man whose ambition was a hunger that could never be sated. He had coveted the Valerius lands for years, but more than that, he had envied the effortless respect Lord Valerius commanded. Theron had to buy his loyalty, but Alaina's father had earned it with kindness. Now, with Lord Valerius dead and his name branded traitor, Theron was finally tasting the victory he craved. And this, the public degradation of his rival's only child, was the sweetest part of the feast. He raised a hand, and a reluctant silence fell over the crowd. "Good people," he began, his voice smooth as poisoned honey. "Justice has been served upon the traitor Valerius. His lands are forfeit to the crown, his legacy erased. And his daughter," he gestured down at Alaina, as if presenting a fine horse, "is now but chattel, a slave to be sold to the highest bidder." Alaina flinched at the word slave. It was a brand, a final stripping of her identity. She was no longer Lady Alaina of Silverwood. She was an object, a collection of limbs and labor to be owned. Her father's face flashed in her memory, his kind eyes, the way he would praise her stitching or her knowledge of the law. He had raised her to be a partner, a leader, not this. She clung to that memory, a secret shield against the crushing weight of her reality. The bidding began. It was slow, insulting. A farmer offered 3 copper coins. A Pokeby blacksmith, known for his cruelty to his apprentices, offered 5. They were not bidding on her value, but on the novelty of owning a lady. Each bid was a fresh humiliation, a confirmation of how little she was worth in this new world. Baron Theron let the pitiful offers hang in the air, drawing out her suffering for his own amusement. He felt a surge of absolute power. This was better than any battle won. To stand here and watch the last piece of the Valerius legacy be sold for scrap was a vindication of his entire life. He had proven that his way, the way of ruthless ambition, was stronger than the Valerius way of honor and duty. Finally, a new voice cut through the low murmurs. A portly merchant, dripping with sweat despite the cold, pushed his way to the front. His eyes, small and piggy, roamed over Alaina's form with a possessive hunger. 50 silver pieces, he shouted, his voice thick with avarice, for the novelty of her. A gasp rippled through the crowd. It was a fortune for a single slave. No one else could match it. Baron Theron's smile widened. He had not expected such a profitable end to his revenge. It was a fittingly vulgar end for the house of Valerius. 50 silver pieces from the esteemed Master Grimald, Theron announced. his gaze flicking to Alaina, searching for a crack in her composure. A generous bid, going once, going twice. He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting her feel the finality of it. He brought his hand down sharply on the balcony rail. Sold! Alaina's breath caught in her throat. Her small rebellion of dignity shattered. Master Grimald, the merchant, grinned, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. He lumbered forward, his heavy footsteps thudding on the damp earth. The crowd parted before him as he approached the auction block, his eyes never leaving her. He was her master now. Her life was his to do with as he pleased. He reached the block, his shadow falling over her, and slowly he raised a thick, fleshy hand to claim his new property. The merchant's fingers, thick as sausages and grimy at the knuckles, reached for her arm. Alaina squeezed her eyes shut, a silent prayer dying on her lips. She braced herself for the touch that would signal the end of her world, the final seal on her degradation. The stench of stale sweat and cheap ale washed over her, and she felt a wave of nausea. This was it. This was her life now, a property to be handled, used, and discarded. But the touch never came. Instead, a sound cut through the air, sharp and heavy. A thud, followed by the clatter of coins spilling onto stone. Alaina's eyes snapped open. The merchant, Grimald, was frozen in place, his hand hovering inches from her arm. His fleshy face was a mask of confusion, his gaze fixed on something beyond her. A shadow had fallen over the auction block, a shadow so vast it seemed to swallow the weak afternoon light. It belonged to a man who stood as still and silent as a mountain. He was immense, cloaked in dark, travel-stained wool, his face obscured by a deep hood. But it was the silence around him that was most profound. The jeering crowd, the entire bustling square, had gone utterly quiet. Even Baron Theron on his balcony seemed to have shrunk, his smug expression replaced by one of disbelief and something that looked almost like fear. The source of the sound was a heavy leather pouch now lying at Baron Theron's feet on the balcony. Gold and silver coins spilled from its open mouth, a king's ransom glittering against the stone. It was a sum that made the merchant's 50 pieces of silver look like a beggar's pittance. The hooded man finally moved. He raised his head slightly, and the light caught the landscape of his face. A vicious scar, old and white, cut down from his temple across his eye and disappeared into a rough beard. It was a mark of brutal violence, a roadmap of battles won. It was the face of the king's champion, Lord Garrick, the Iron Vulture, a man, more myth than courtier, seen only on the battlefield or in the king's private war council. He felt the eyes of the crowd on him, the fear and awe. He ignored them. His gaze was fixed on the girl on the block. He did not see a slave. He saw the ghost of a promise. He saw the daughter of Lord Valerius, the only man who had ever offered him a place at his fire, not as a weapon, but as a knight. The guilt of his failure on that terrible night was a cold stone in his gut. He had been too late to save her father. He would not be too late to save her. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, like stones grinding together. It was a voice unused to pleasantries, a voice that gave commands and expected them to be obeyed without question. She is mine. The words were not a bid. They were a statement of fact. Baron Theron, for the first time that day, was speechless. His face flushed a deep, mottled red. This was a direct challenge to his authority, a public rebuke, from the king's own weapon. He opened his mouth to protest, to speak of law and property, but the words died in his throat as Garrick's cold, unwavering gaze settled on him. Alaina trembled, caught between two terrifying forces. She had been saved from the lecherous merchant, only to be claimed by the most feared warrior in the Seven Kingdoms. She did not know what this meant. Was this a rescue, or simply a transfer of ownership to a more powerful master? She saw no kindness in his scarred face, only a grim, unreadable determination. He moved toward her, his heavy boots making no sound on the muddy ground. He stepped onto the block and without a word took her by the upper arm. His grip was firm, inescapable, But there was no cruelty in it. It was not the grip of a master claiming his property. It was the grip of a soldier securing something precious. He led her down from the block and through the crowd. The people scrambled to get out of his way, their fear a palpable thing. No one met his eyes. They simply stared at the ground as he passed, this silent, scarred legend and the girl he now owned. Alaina followed, her feet numb, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror. She risked a glance back at the balcony. Baron Theron stood clutching the rail, his face a mask of pure, impotent fury. His perfect victory had been stolen from him in a heartbeat. She had been saved from one cruel fate, only to be bound to a man whose face was a map of brutal battles. When all hope is lost, does it matter which hand pulls you from the darkness? Or is any hand, even a scarred and fearsome one, a reason to keep breathing? Alaina did not know the answer. She only knew the firm grip on her arm and the broad, silent back of the man leading her away from the town, away from the world she knew, and into a future more uncertain than any she could have ever imagined. The journey was a silent one. Lord Garrick set a relentless pace, moving through the thinning woodlands and into the rugged hill country with the grim purpose of a man who saw the world as territory to be crossed, not a place to be lived in. He had procured a horse for Alaina, a sturdy, placid mare that seemed untroubled by the terrain. He himself walked, leading his own war-horse, his long strides eating up the miles. He did not speak to her, not once. Yet, in the deepening twilight of that first day, as a cold rain began to fall, he stopped and unfastened the heavy fur-lined cloak from his own shoulders. He draped it over her without a word. The wool was thick and smelled of leather, wood smoke, and the cold, clean air of the mountains. It was heavy, with a warmth that sank deep into her chilled bones, a stark contrast to the thin burlap she had worn for what felt like an eternity. Alaina huddled deeper into the cloak, her mind a tumult of fear and confusion. Every league they traveled took her further from everything she had ever known. She watched the man who led her, this silent champion. She had expected brutality, or at the very least, a cold indifference. But this was something else. It was a calculated, impersonal sort of care. When they made camp, he would build a fire with swift, economical movements, roast a piece of salted meat, and hand her a portion on the tip of his dagger before taking his own. He never ate until she had. It was the detached efficiency of a soldier tending to a valuable piece of equipment, not the kindness of one person to another. Still, no one had ensured she was fed or warm since her father's death. She was a possession, but she was a well-tended one. The thought brought her no comfort, only a deeper sense of unease. She did not know the rules of this new captivity, and the not knowing was its own form of torment. After 3 days of hard travel, the land changed again. The air grew sharp with the taste of salt, and the constant roar of the sea became a companion to the sound of the wind. They crested a final hill, and she saw it. His keep. It was not a castle built for beauty or prestige. It was a fortress, a jagged tooth of dark gray stone that seemed to grow directly from the cliff's edge, daring the stormy sea below to do its worst. It was as stark, scarred, and intimidating as its master. As they drew closer, the sheer scale of it was overwhelming. It looked like a place where laughter went to die. A few guards, clad in practical leather and steel, patrolled the ramparts. They saluted Garrick with a silent fist to the chest as he led the horses through the massive iron gate and into a wind-swept courtyard. No one spoke. The silence here was a living thing, broken only by the cry of gulls and the crashing of waves against the rocks. Garrick led her from the courtyard into the great hall. The chamber was vast and echoing, dominated by a cavernous, cold hearth. Heavy tapestries depicting grim battle scenes hung on the stone walls, their colors faded by time and sea air. A handful of men, soldiers by their bearing, sat at a long table, sharpening blades or mending gear. They looked up as Garrick entered, nodded in deference, but their eyes slid past Alaina as if she were not there. She felt invisible, a ghost in this hall of silent, watchful men. Without pausing, Garrick led her up a winding stone staircase, his footsteps echoing in the crushing quiet. They stopped before a heavy door of dark, aged oak, bound with iron. He lifted a thick iron key from his belt and turned it in the lock. The sound of the tumblers shifting was unnervously loud. He pushed the door open and stepped back, gesturing for her to enter. Alaina hesitated, her heart pounding. She expected a cell, a place of cold stone and straw. But the room was not a dungeon. It was sparse, yes, but it was clean. A bed built into the wall was piled with thick furs. A small fire was already laid in the hearth, its embers glowing with welcome heat. A single, narrow window, secured with iron bars, looked out, not on the courtyard, but upon the endless churning expanse of the sea. She looked from the room back to Lord Garrick. He stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking out the light from the hall. He had not stepped inside. His gaze met hers for a fleeting second, unreadable as ever. Then he looked down at the iron key still in his hand. He held it out, not to her, but placed it deliberately on a small, sturdy table, set just inside the room. The meaning was as clear as any words. The room was hers. The key was hers. The ability to lock the door against him, against the world, was hers. He gave a single curt nod, then turned and walked away. His footsteps receded down the stone corridor, the sound growing fainter and fainter until it was swallowed by the ever-present roar of the sea. Alaina stood frozen in the doorway, the key a stark piece of iron against the dark wood of the table. Slowly, as if in a dream, she reached out and closed her fingers around it. The metal was cold and heavy. She stepped fully into the room and pushed the heavy oak door. It swung shut with a deep, resonant thud, plunging the room into the warm, flickering light of the fire. She was alone, truly alone, for the first time in months, and for the first time she was safe. She looked at the key in her hand, then back at the solid, unbreachable door, and had no idea what to feel. For 2 days, Alaina did not leave the room. She listened to the rhythm of the keep, the distant clang of a hammer on steel, the changing shifts of the guards, and the eternal crashing of the waves. Twice a day she would find a tray of food left silently outside her door. It was always simple: bread, cheese, a piece of smoked fish, or a bowl of thick stew, but it was always hot and nourishing. She would take it, lock the door, and eat by the fire, a prisoner feasting in solitude. On the 3rd day, a desperate need for air drove her from her sanctuary. Clutching the heavy iron key in her pocket like a talisman, she ventured out. She crept through the stone hallways, expecting a command or a challenge at any moment, but none came. The men of the keep, few as they were, simply averted their eyes as she passed, granting her an invisibility that was both a relief and a profound loneliness. She found a small walled courtyard on the leeward side of the keep, sheltered from the worst of the sea wind. It was utterly neglected, the stone planters choked with weeds and salt-water-burned grasses. But beneath the decay, she saw the ghost of what it once was. She recognized the hardy stems of sea lavender, the withered leaves of rosemary, and the stubborn roots of thyme. It was an herb garden, a piece of the world that she understood. From that day on, the garden became her purpose. She spent hours under the gray sky patiently clearing the weeds, turning the soil with a rusted trowel she found in a forgotten shed. It was hard, thankless work, but it was hers. It was a small patch of order she could create in a world of chaos. One afternoon, while tending to a patch of stubborn thorns, she saw him. Lord Garrick was in the main training yard below, practicing with a great sword. He moved with a brutal, focused grace that was terrifying to behold. He was not a man, but a weapon, given human form. Yet, as he finished a powerful series of strikes, she saw him wince and roll his shoulder, a flicker of pain crossing his scarred face before he suppressed it. An idea took root in her mind, a daring, foolish thought. That evening, using the herbs she had carefully cultivated, She prepared a soothing poultice, a recipe her mother had taught her. Her hands trembled as she ground the leaves, mixing them with a little oil. It felt like a trespass, an overstepping of some invisible boundary. What if he was angered by her presumption? Swallowing her fear, she crept down to the now empty training yard. She left the small ceramic bowl of dark green paste on a stone bench near the weapon racks. A silent, anonymous offering. She fled back to her room, her heart pounding, certain she had made a terrible mistake. The next day, she watched from her window again. The bowl was gone. He was in the yard, and as he moved through his forms, she could see it. The stiffness in his shoulder was gone. He moved with a fluid, lethal power. The hint of pain completely vanished. He never looked up, never gave any sign that he knew she was watching, but she felt a current pass between them. Her message had been received and accepted. A week passed. A quiet, unspoken truce settled between them. She tended her garden. He left her food. They were two lonely stars orbiting in the same dark sky, never touching, but aware of each other's presence. The fear in her heart had begun to recede, replaced by a deep, aching curiosity. One evening she returned to her room, chilled from the sea air. The fire had been stoked, the embers glowing brightly, and resting on the simple woolen blanket of her bed was a small object, something that did not belong. It was a small silver locket shaped like a bird in flight. It was tarnished and dented as if it had been pulled from rubble and ruin. Her breath hitched, her legs grew weak, and she sank to her knees beside the bed. It was her mother's, the locket she wore every day of her life, the one Alaina thought had been lost forever, melted in the fire that destroyed their home. He must have sent someone. He must have had them sift through the ashes of her past to find this one, priceless thing. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the familiar shape. She snapped it open. Inside were the two tiny painted portraits, her father handsome and smiling, and her mother, her eyes full of the same gentle light that Alaina remembered so well. A sob broke from her chest, the first she had allowed herself since the day her world ended. The tears came then, a hot, silent flood, for the parents she had lost, for the home that was gone, and for the overwhelming, impossible kindness of the scarred and silent man who had brought a piece of it back to her. She clutched the locket to her heart, the cold metal a stark contrast to the burning question in her soul. This was not the act of a jailer. This was not the act of a master. This was something else entirely. Who was this man? And why, in all the world, was he doing this for her? The silver locket was more than a trinket. It was a question. And to understand the answer, to comprehend the silent vow of the man known as the Iron Vulture, one must look to the past, to a time before the scars marred his face and a deeper wound silenced his soul. Garrick was once just a boy, landless and fierce, with a strength that made other men nervous. He was a weapon for hire, a blunt instrument passed from one petty lord to another, used in skirmishes and then discarded. They saw the fury in his fists, but never the honor in his heart. They fed him scraps and pointed him at their enemies, but no one ever offered him a place by their fire, until Lord Valerius of Silverwood. Alaina's father saw something different. He saw past the raw, untamed power and recognized a core of unwavering loyalty. Lord Valerius did not hire Garrick's sword. He offered him a home. He gave him new armor, not as a tool of war, but as the raiment of a knight of his household. He spoke to Garrick not as a subordinate, but as a man, asking his counsel and trusting his word. For the first time in his life, Garrick was not just a fighter. He was a protector. And for that, he gave Lord Valerius his silent, absolute devotion. That devotion was put to its ultimate test on a moonless night, the night the fire came. Baron Theron did not declare war. He was a coward who dealt in treachery. His men crept into the estate under the cover of darkness, their swords wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. The attack was swift, brutal, and without honor. Garrick fought like a cornered wolf. He was a storm of steel in the Ostic, always of the home he had sworn to protect, cutting down Theron's men as he tried desperately to reach the family's chambers. He was not fighting for a lord. He was fighting for the man who had shown him kindness, for the lady who treated him with grace, and for their young daughter, Alaina, who would leave wild flowers on the pommel of his practiced sword. He broke through to the great hall just in time to see Lord Valerius fall, a dozen blades buried in his chest. A roar of pure, animalistic fury tore from Garrick's throat. He charged into the fray, his great sword a blur of vengeance. But in his grief-stricken rage, he was reckless. One of Theron's lieutenants, a man with a cruel smile, struck from the side. The blade was poisoned, and it carved a burning, agonizing path down Garrick's face. The pain was blinding, but the agony of his failure was 1,000 times worse. He collapsed, the last thing he saw being the flames licking up the tapestries of the home he had failed. He was left for dead, a broken tool amidst the ruin. He crawled from the burning manor with the last of his strength, his life bleeding out into the cold earth. And there, under the smoke-choked sky, as the life he knew turned to ash, he made a vow. He had failed the father. He would not fail the daughter. That vow became his reason to breathe. It fueled his recovery. It drove him to become the most feared warrior in the realm, to earn the king's favor, to build a fortress of power and reputation around himself so that no one, not even a king, could ever stand between him and his promise. Years later, standing on the cold ramparts of his keep, that vow was the first thing he thought of each morning, and the last thing he considered each night. He watched Alaina below, moving through the herb garden she had brought back to life. She was humming, a soft, tuneless sound that the wind carried up to him. It was a sound of contentment, a sound that had not been heard within these walls in a decade. He had brought her here to be her shield, but her quiet resilience, her defiant act of creating life in this place of stone and sorrow, was unintentionally mending a wound in him he thought was fatal. Her presence was a balm on the old, bitter guilt. In saving her, he was slowly, painfully saving himself. For the first time, the warmth he felt watching her was not the heat of duty, but the flicker of something else, something new and fragile and terrifying. As he stood there, lost in a moment of unexpected peace, a single sharp blast from a horn echoed from the watchtower. It was not the frantic call to arms, but the clear, piercing signal of an approaching messenger. Garrick's eyes narrowed. He looked past the garden toward the winding coastal road. A lone rider was approaching, moving fast, their banner whipping in the wind. It was the royal standard of the king. The outside world, with all its cruelty and politics, had found them. The peace was as fragile as a bird's egg, and the messenger's horn shattered it completely. The man who entered the great hall was everything the keep was not. He was polished, perfumed, and wore the condescending smirk of a man who thrived in the snake pit of the royal court. His fine boots seemed offended by the stone floor, and his eyes darted around the stark, weapon-lined walls with disdain. He held a scroll bound with a ribbon of royal purple, the wax seal of the king, unbroken. Lord Garrick met him in the center of the hall. He did not offer the man wine or rest. He simply stood there, a mountain of silent inquiry, waiting. From the shadows of the upper staircase, Alaina watched, her hand clutching the locket through the thin fabric of her dress. The sight of the royal seal sent a lance of pure fear through her heart. The world she had been so grateful to escape had sent an emissary. The courtier unrolled the scroll with a flourish, his voice ringing with false importance. "By order of His Royal Majesty, King Theron II," he began, and Alaina noted with a sickening jolt that the king shared the baron's name, a cousin who owed him many favors. "It has come to our attention that you, Lord Garrick, champion of the realm, have unlawfully seized property belonging to our loyal subject, Baron Theron of Ashwood." Every word was a hammer blow. The courtier's voice droned on, citing laws of purchase and property, framing Baron Theron as a wronged man and Garrick as a common thief. Alaina felt the blood drain from her face. They were talking about her as if she were a stolen horse. Garrick remained motionless, his face an unreadable mask of scarred stone. But inside him, a cold, familiar rage began to build. It was the same fury he had felt on the night of the fire. The law, the very thing he had once respected, was being twisted into a weapon to hurt her, just as Theron had twisted knives in the dark to hurt her father. The king was demanding he betray the single, sacred vow that had given his life meaning. Therefore, the messenger's voice rose to a triumphant crescendo. The king commands you to surrender the chattel, the girl formerly known as Alaina Valerius, to the custody of Baron Theron, who shall claim his rightful property. Failure to comply within 1 week's time will be considered an act of treason. You shall be stripped of your titles, your lands, and hunted as an enemy of the crown. The silence that followed was absolute. The smug courtier rolled up the Mao scroll, a look of profound satisfaction on his face. He had delivered a killing blow, and he knew it. He had cornered the iron vulture. Alaina leaned against the cold stone of the wall, her legs threatening to give way. Treason. He would become a traitor for her. The safety she had found in this keep, the fragile hope she had begun to nurture, all of it dissolved, leaving only the stark, terrifying reality. The shadow of Baron Theron had stretched all the way from his dark heart to the doors of her sanctuary. Garrick finally moved. He took a single step forward, his hand outstretched. The messenger, thinking he was taking the scroll, held it out. Garrick took it from his grasp, but he did not read it. He slowly, deliberately, rolled it back into a tight cylinder. He walked to a nearby torch sconce and held the edge of the parchment to the flame. The purple ribbon blackened, and the parchment caught fire. The messenger stared, his mouth agape in horror, as the king's own words, the king's own seal, turned to black ash in the champion's hand. Garrick let the burning scroll fall to the floor and crushed the last embers under the heel of his boot. He raised his eyes to the terrified courtier. His voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried more menace than any shout. "Go!" The man needed no further encouragement. He scrambled from the hall like a frightened rat, his polished boots slipping on the stone as he fled the keep. The law of the land, written on parchment and sealed, with wax demanded she be returned to the darkness. But the law of the heart, forged in fire and a knight's guilt, demanded she be protected. When the laws of men are wielded as weapons of cruelty, what anchor is left for a soul to cling to? In the days that followed, the keep transformed. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was tense, watchful. The few men under Garrick's command worked tirelessly, sharpening blades, reinforcing the gate, and stocking supplies. They asked no questions. Their loyalty was to the man, not to a distant king or his corrupt decrees. Garrick was preparing for a siege. He had made his choice. On the 7th day, the lookout horn blared, not the single note of a messenger, but a long, sustained blast of alarm. Alaina ran to the narrow window in her room, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. On the coastal road below, a column of men approached. There were at least 50, armed and armored, a small army, and at their head, riding a black war horse, and wearing a helmet plumed with ostentatious feathers, was a figure she would recognize in the deepest pits of hell. It was Baron Theron. He had come himself, wrapped in the authority of the king, to drag her back into the world of pain she had just escaped. The enemy was at the gate. The heavy bar on the main gate was lifted with a groaning screech of wood against iron. It swung open, not to admit the visitors, but to reveal the obstacle that stood in their way. Lord Garrick stood alone in the gateway, his feet planted wide. He wore no helmet, and his great sword remained sheathed on his back. His scarred face was grim, his posture an unbreachable wall of defiance. He was one man against 50, and he did not look concerned. Baron Theron trotted his horse forward, a cruel, triumphant smile on his face. He held up a fresh scroll, the king's seal dangling from it like a jewel. "Garrick, your time is done. In the name of the king, I demand you surrender this fortress and the stolen property within." "Captain!" he barked at the stern-faced man beside him, the leader of the king's guard. "Arrest this traitor." The captain, a veteran whose face spoke of duty above all else, dismounted. He looked at Garrick, a flicker of respect, warring with his orders. "Lord Garrick," he said, his voice heavy, "you have been branded a traitor. Lay down your arms and come with us. Do not make this harder than it needs to be." His men began to advance, their shields raised. It was the moment before the storm, the heartbeat before the slaughter. Garrick's hand moved, ready to unsheath his sword and meet his end in a torrent of violence, but a second figure appeared in the gateway. It was Alaina. She moved from the shadows of the hall to stand beside Garrick, her back straight, her chin held high. She was no longer the frightened girl from the auction block. Clad in a simple but clean woolen dress, with her mother's locket resting against her collarbone, she looked every bit the lady she was born to be. Garrick glanced at her, his eyes widening in surprise. A protective instinct surged through him, a desire to shove her back into the safety of the keep. But there was a strength in her stance he had not seen before, a fire in her eyes that mirrored his own. He held his ground. He trusted her. She did not look at Baron Theron. Her clear, calm gaze was fixed entirely on the captain of the guard. "Captain," she said, her voice steady and carrying in the tense silence, "you are a servant of the king's law, are you not?" Captain stopped, taken aback. "I am." "Then you know the laws concerning the nobility," Alaina continued. "You know that a person of noble blood cannot be bought or sold as chattel. To do so is a grave crime." Baron Theron scoffed. "She was declared chattel by the crown. She is my property." Alaina ignored him, keeping her focus on the captain. "The payment Lord Garrick made was not a purchase price. It was a guardian's ransom, an ancient and honored right under the law, where a landed lord may pay to take a fallen or orphaned noble into his protection, to act as their legal ward until they come of age or are married. It is his duty to protect me, a duty sanctioned by the very laws you have sworn to uphold." She took a step forward, her voice ringing with a newfound power. "It is Baron Theron who breaks the law, Captain. He has used his influence to deceive the king and has leveraged royal authority to illegally enslave a daughter of a noble house for his own personal gain. Look at his decree. Does it not name me as chattel? That in itself is the proof of his crime, not mine." A murmur went through the royal guards. The captain stared at Alaina, then at the decree in Theron's hand, then back to Alaina. He was a man of the law, and her words were a spear of pure, simple logic. He had been sent to enforce a property seizure, but he was being asked to participate in a crime against the nobility. He could see the truth of it in the righteous fire of her eyes and the silent, unyielding strength of the champion beside her. He slowly, deliberately lowered his sword. He turned to the Baron. "My lord," he said, his voice now cold and formal, "this is a matter for the courts, not the battlefield. My orders were to retrieve property, not to aid in a crime. We will not raise a hand against Lord Garrick." He signaled to his men, who lowered their weapons in relief. Baron Theron's face became a mask of disbelief, which quickly curdled into pure incandescent rage. He had been beaten, not by the warrior's sword, but by the victim's words. He had been publicly shamed and outmaneuvered by the very girl he had sought to break. The thin veneer of his courtly civility shattered, revealing the feral beast beneath. With a guttural scream of pure hatred, he ripped his own sword from its scabbard. "If the law will not give her to me," he shrieked, his eyes wild and bloodshot, "then my blade will." He spurred his horse forward. Charging directly at the gateway, his sword aimed straight for Garrick's heart. The Baron's charge was an act of pure desperation, a wild, clumsy attack fueled by wounded pride. It was over in seconds. As the sword point lunged for his chest, Garrick moved with an economy of motion that was breathtaking. He sidestepped the charging warhorse, his hand a blur as he drew his own great sword. He did not bring the flat of the blade against Theron, but against the horse's flank, a sharp, stinging slap that was startling, but not cruel. The beast screamed and reared, its discipline broken by the surprise. Baron Theron, more courtier than horseman, was thrown from the saddle, landing in a graceless heap in the mud at the keep's gate. His sword flew from his hand, skittering across the cobblestones. Garrick placed the tip of his great sword at the hollow of Theron's throat. The Baron, winded and humiliated, froze, his eyes wide with terror. But Garrick did not look at the pathetic man on the ground. His cold gaze was on the captain of the Royal Guard. For the first time since speaking Alaina's name at the auction, he spoke at length, his voice a low, hard rumble that cut through the silence. "This man did not just try to enslave a noblewoman, Captain," Garrick stated, his words clear and precise. "His crimes are far older and carry a much higher price." He reached inside his tunic and pulled out a small oilskin-wrapped packet. He tossed it to the captain, who caught it instinctively. "That is the sworn confession of a man who served Baron Theron, a man who witnessed him give the order to murder Lord Valerius and his lady wife, a man who watched Theron's men set the fire that destroyed their home, and brand an honorable man a traitor, all so he could seize his lands and feed his pathetic envy." The captain unwrapped the packet. His eyes scanned the parchment within, his face growing grimmer with every line he read. The proof, hidden and guarded by Garrick for years, waiting for the right moment, was undeniable. "His attack on me is meaningless," Garrick continued, his voice resonating with the weight of a decade of silence. "But his treason against the house of Valerius, his murder of a loyal lord of the realm, that is a debt that must be paid in full." The captain looked up from the confession, his face set like stone. He looked at the disgraced baron whimpering on the ground, then at the proud, defiant lady standing beside the champion. He had his orders from the king, but the evidence before him spoke of a deeper law, a deeper justice. He made his choice. "Baron Theron," the captain declared, his voice ringing with authority, "by the power vested in me by the crown, I arrest you for high treason and the murder of Lord Elian Valerius." He motioned to two of his guards. "Seize him." Theron shrieked as they hauled him to his feet, his struggles weak and pitiful. "You cannot do this. I am a baron. The king will have your head for this," he screamed, his threats turning to sobs as they bound his hands and dragged him away, a broken man whose cruelty had finally consumed him. The captain gave Garrick a long, measured look. "The king will hear of this, of all of it." He gave a sharp nod, a gesture of respect from one soldier to another. Then he mounted his horse, and with his remaining men followed the prisoner back down the coastal road, leaving justice in his wake. An immense quiet descended upon the courtyard. The threat was gone. The shadow that had loomed for so long had finally passed. Alaina and Garrick stood in the gateway, the setting sun casting long shadows behind them and bathing the keep in a soft, golden light. The air, which moments before had been thick with tension and the scent of violence, was now still and clean, filled only with the sound of the sea. Garrick finally sheathed his sword, the sound of the steel sliding home, seeming to mark the end of an entire chapter of their lives. He turned to her, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes beyond the grim duty of a protector. She saw relief. She saw a deep, weary peace. The vow he had carried alone for so many years was finally fulfilled. He slowly raised his hand, the one with knuckles scarred from 100 battles. He thought he might say something, but words were not his way. His calloused fingers, surprisingly gentle, brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, tucking it carefully behind her ear. The simple, tender gesture spoke volumes more than any poem or pronouncement. It was an acknowledgment, a question, a statement. Alaina did not pull back. A warmth spread through her chest, a feeling of absolute safety that had nothing to do with stone walls or armed guards. This man, who had been her shield, was now simply a man standing before her. She met his gaze, and with a certainty that rose from the deepest part of her soul, she reached out and took his large, scarred hand in both of hers. She did not speak. She simply held it, her small hands enfolding his. It was not a gesture of fear or gratitude or dependence. It was an answer. It was an unspoken vow of her own. 5 years passed. The seasons turned, washing the coastline with winter storms and warming it with the gentle sun of summer. The world beyond the keep continued its dance of politics and power. The king, shamed by the revelation of Baron Theron's crimes, officially restored the Valerius name and titles, bestowing them upon Lady Alaina, Theron himself, stripped of his lands and name, rotted in a lightless dungeon, his fate a forgotten footnote in the annals of the court. But within the walls of the fortress on the cliff, a different kind of history was being written. The keep was no longer a place of stone and silence. The stark gray walls were softened by climbing roses that Alaina had planted, their defiant crimson a splash of life against the stone. The courtyard garden, once a forgotten patch of weeds, was now a lush and fragrant tapestry of herbs and vegetables, buzzing with the hum of fat bumblebees. The scent of baking bread often drifted from the kitchens, and the great hall, once cold and empty, now held a long table, polished by frequent use, its surface bearing the nicks and rings of shared meals and quiet conversations. The fortress had become a home. Alaina sat on a stone bench in her garden, a small sewing basket at her feet. She was mending a tear in a boy's tunic, her fingers moving with a familiar, practiced grace. The sea wind was gentle today, and it played with loose strands of her hair. A quiet smile touched her lips. The fear that had once been her constant companion was a distant memory, a ghost from another life. She was the lady of the keep now, and her authority came not from a title, but from the love and purpose she had woven into every stone of this place. Across the garden, Garrick sat on the steps of the armory, sharpening a small wooden sword with a knife. He wore no armor, only a simple linen shirt that showed the powerful lines of his shoulders and arms. The sun warmed his scarred face, and the grim tension that had once settled deep in his features was gone, smoothed away by time and peace. He was no longer the iron vulture, the silent, haunted champion. He was a husband and a father. A small boy with Alaina's bright, curious eyes and his father's sturdy frame ran between them, chasing a butterfly with a stick that was far too large for him. His laughter, clear and joyous, echoed in the courtyard. He was the living, breathing proof of their victory, a symbol of the new life they had built from the ashes of the old. The boy, tiring of his chase, ran to his father, holding up the wooden sword. "Is it sharp yet, Papa?" he asked, his voice full of childish importance. Garrick tested the edge with his thumb, his expression one of mock seriousness. "Almost, Elian. A knight's blade must be perfect." He looked up then, and his eyes met. Alaina's across the garden. He smiled, a genuine, easy smile that still made her heart ache with a gentle joy. She smiled back, a world of love and understanding passing between them in that silent, sunlit moment. All the pain, all the fear, all the lonely years had been worth it to arrive here, to find this. They had been two broken souls, cast out and condemned by a cruel world. He, a warrior chained to a guilty vow. She, a lady stripped of everything but her dignity. But through a single, unexpected act of honor and the quiet, sacred language of care, they had built a sanctuary, not of stone, but of trust. They had become each other's shield, and in doing so had found a peace more profound than any king could grant. Garrick set aside the toy sword and held out his arms. The boy scrambled into his lap, curling against his father's strong chest. Alaina put down her sewing, her work forgotten. She simply watched her two knights, her husband and her son, bathed in the golden light of the afternoon. The sound of the sea was a gentle rhythm beneath the sound of her child's happy sigh. All was well. This was peace at last. And so we close the book on this chapter, leaving our lovers to their well-earned peace. But the night is long, and my satchel is full of other tales, of cursed lords, forgotten princesses, and silent protectors. To ensure you do not miss the next telling to our chronicle, and claim your place by the hearth when a new story begins.